Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome to the fifth and final debate of the 2020 China Power Debate Series. I'm Bonnie Glaser, Director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks to all of you for joining us today virtually. Before we begin our debate, we have a special guest joining us to talk about U.S. China relations. I'm delighted to have with us Congressman Rick Larsen, who represents the 2nd Congressional District of Washington State, and importantly for this conversation, is the co-chair of the Bipartisan U.S China Working Group, which was created in 2005 to provide accurate information to members of Congress on critical issues pertaining to China, and to provide a forum for discussion with Chinese officials and leaders. And in this capacity, Congressman Larsen has really made a significant contribution to the understanding of China within Congress. He's frequently engaged with experts on China as well to discuss China's internal developments and its evolving approach to the world. And I admire his determination to help Congress understand China and his dedication to protecting American interests and to promoting better understanding between our two countries. So we're going to start with some framing remarks from Congressman Larsen, and then I'll pose a few questions. If time allows, we'll take a few questions from our viewers. And if you want to submit a question, you can go to the CSIS page for this event and click on the Ask Live Questions button. So with that, I would like to hear, Congressman Larsen, your perspectives on U.S.-China relations at this really challenging time for our country and so many people around the world.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bonnie, and thanks to CSIS China Power for asking me to say a few words and take a few questions. I'm coming to you live from Everett, Washington today. It's early in the morning out here in Washington State. And for your viewers who might be interested in a couple things unrelated, I am flying back later today. There does seem to be inklings of a deal on the omnibus spending bill to keep the government open and funded through September 30th. And so it sounds like we may be filing that package today with the House representatives voting Wednesday or Thursday, with the Senate following. And as well, COVID-19 negotiations continue, but I mean, we're nearly out of time, but there are only a few issues really left to consider. And I think just as for people who are interested in the functioning of your federal government, I think it's important I make that note to everybody. I want to thank you for a chance to say a few words about this relationship, because it has evolved since 2005, when Mark Kirk and I started the U.S. China Working Group in Congress. You know, we began that, as you noted, to help educate members of Congress about the relationship that exists between the United States and China. And one of the fundamental tenets of the U.S. China Working Group is that we don't think there is one relationship between the U.S. and China, that it's various relationships depending upon the issue. And over time, depending on the issue, things have gone well and things have gone poorly. I think right now, if you look at the general direction of the overall relationship, it's not going very well at all. That's not breaking news, I'm sure, for anyone. But I do think it has an implication for the incoming administration and implications for Congress as well. One of the ways I've tried to categorize members of Congress this is my political science in me, that one day I want to be a political scientist. So finding ways to classify and categorize things is important. We've always talked about the hawk and dove metaphor when talking about how we approach national security, foreign policy, and with regard to China, we had, economic security hawks. Those are the kind of the trade protectionist, China's eating our lunch folks. National security hawks with concerns about military modernization and not just the rise of China economically, but the rise of China militarily. And then human rights hawks, those members of Congress who focus a lot on issues like these days, like Hong Kong and Xinjiang. But that classification really isn't, I think, an accurate description or as helpful as looking at members of Congress and their approaches a different way. And so I've got a different way to think about them as punishers, decouplers, and salvagers. That is, from a legislative perspective, we've had 300, 400 pieces of legislation introduced just in this 116th Congress on China, where members of Congress are taking an approach to punish China. Think of sanctions on individuals as an example. So those are the kind of the punishers. Then there are the decouplers, looking at the economic relationship, but trying to really sever that economic relationship. And then the salvagers, which I would put me in that category, and people like Darren LaHood, a Republican who's the co-chair of the U.S. China Working Group, recognizing there's areas of where we're going to conflict, where we're going to compete, but there are areas where we need to cooperate. And so trying to salvage parts of that relationship in a way that keeps a process open to think about this relationship strategically. And I think that's where we sit today. And I think that's what the incoming administration needs to consider, that Congress has changed, the center of gravity on China has changed in Congress. And that as the Biden-Harris team approaches Congress, say for nomination fights, or for even crafting legislation or crafting approach when they're talking to members of Congress, keeping in mind that there is that center of gravity has changed, that there are folks who are punishers and decouplers and salvagers as well. And so I think it's going to prove to be an interesting time, because the administration probably doesn't have a lot of time to to accept this from Congress and adjust. And so as we think about the Biden-Harris team and who they're putting in place in these positions, I think they need to be thinking about how they're going to approach members of Congress, how they're going to approach the Senate for confirmations, keeping this change in the center of gravity in mind. And finally, we'll note on 2 points, 1 point with two an A and a B here. There are 2 areas where I don't think there's a lot of wiggle room from Congress. One is on human rights. I've seen several pieces of legislation on Xinjiang pass. We've seen Congress the House and Senate taking a much stronger vocal and rhetorical stance on what's going on in Hong Kong with the national security law and its implementation. And not many, but several members of Congress, like myself, we've met some of these folks in Hong Kong who have been arrested, and have had conversations with them in the past. We know them, the young and the old. And so I think that there's not a lot of wiggle room on the role of human rights and how we approach that from the U.S. perspective. The second, where I think there's not a lot of wiggle room, is in the issue of technology. Folks have, not me, I won't claim this as mine, but I'll say it. Some folks say we're not in a trade war with China, we're in a tech war. And I think from a congressional perspective, most members of Congress who follow this issue believe that's true. And so having an approach on technology, on technology transfers, on 5G investment, on the role of artificial intelligence and its uses, the development of algorithms and who gets their hands on those, the administration is going to really have to keep that issue really close at heart, because I think in Congress we see technology and this fourth industrial revolution as a economic advantage that we don't want to lose. If we are losing it, we want to get it back. And so probably not a lot of wiggle room for the incoming administration on that either. So those are just some thoughts I'll toss out for you, Bonnie, and the good folks on the podcast and the webinar. to think about, and turn it back over to you.
Great, Congressman. Thanks so much for those really thoughtful remarks. I like your categorization of the different groups in Congress, and may reflect to some extent the broader constituencies and other communities that follow China. But let me ask you whether you really think that there is a bipartisan consensus, at least on some issues. And so many people who talk about views of China today in Congress do say there is now a bipartisan consensus, and not just in Congress, but across other groupings where there's a view that China is now seen as posing the biggest challenge to the United States. As you said, technology seen as a central area of competition. And we know that in the Trump administration that the U.S. China relationship was framed as one of strategic competition, and China was labeled a rival. So if there are areas of consensus in Congress, what do you see as those areas, and what are the key areas of difference?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a variety of areas that cause levels of concern that for members of Congress, and the approaches that would generally have taken have been areas where steps that we've taken that don't really reflect an offense, but rather the United States getting defensive. I'm thinking of on technology. The administration's approach, the current administration's approach, has been less about trying to beat China at its own game, if you want to call it that, or invest and get our own house in order, if you want to call it that. The kinds of things that we can do to make the United States stronger relative to whatever China is doing in technology, much less any other country is doing, so that we provide that other choice or another set of choices for others to make when it comes to 5G investment and the like. What are we doing about being active on standards setting when these groups meet to set standards on technology? Are we being active, or do we have an offensive approach going into these meetings, well laid out plans, working with our friends and allies to ensure that the U.S. ideas about transparency and openness, and as they translate into actual standard setting, is that getting reflected? And I think that's where we lack. So it's not so much, my main criticism is really not that there isn't a consensus, and that consensus is kind of changed the center of gravity to be more negative. It's that we haven't taken the action to look at things beyond just a relationship between the U.S. and China. Now, the China doesn't necessarily look at the U.S. China relationship as strictly its only relationship, as strictly a bilateral relationship, and there's nothing else going on in the world. We've tended to look at the U.S. China relationship as a bilateral, and nothing else is going on in the world that impacts that. We need to do a better job, and this will sound like a broken record, a better job of addressing that consensus and bringing our friends and allies and partners in as part of that, and sometimes taking the lead from our friends and partners and allies as well. So that, I think that's where we should be headed. Again, I don't think that's going to be news to anyone, but I think that's a change that I'd like to see happen in the incoming administration.
You mentioned Hong Kong and human rights as being areas that will continue to receive attention in Congress. And we know that President-elect Biden during the campaign had some tough words to say on both of those issues. And in fact, his campaign did say that what is taking place in Xinjiang in these camps is genocide. And that goes beyond what the Trump administration has said. But the Trump administration did take many actions, particularly in Hong Kong, to change that relationship fundamentally and to try to punish people in Beijing who are responsible for essentially violating one country, two systems, and not respecting the autonomy that was promised to Hong Kong, and of course actions taken on Xinjiang as well. So my question is, what more do you think can be done by Congress or the executive branch in the next administration to try and influence Chinese policies in that area? As you know, it's really hard to influence China's decision-making on those particular issues. So is there more that we could do and that we should do?
Yeah, let me make 2 points before I answer that. Human rights is a long game. And standing up for human rights is a long game. And I think from a rhetorical perspective, the U.S. is going to have to continue to show that leadership in Beijing that we are in for human rights for the long term. It's not going to be a something that we turn on or off. And frankly, that's where Congress is, Democratic and Republican, very bipartisan. And so I hope the Biden team can continue with the strong rhetoric on human rights. The second is finding a way to operationalize that in the relationship. It may become an annoyance to or an outright insult to the Beijing leadership. I don't think that members of Congress are going to care about that. And so the administration is going to have to make the incoming administration will have to make some decision about how strongly they want to continue to press this, because they will get pressure from Congress on finding ways to continue to address human rights in China. I guess a third thing I'd say, there's one more thing, is that I like how you framed that. The Trump administration is really pressed on human rights. I would say, we wouldn't have had to, right? We didn't make the choice to pass a national security law. We didn't make the choice to set up labor camps in Xinjiang, or to try to wipe out the Uyghurs. We're not making those choices. The Chinese leadership is making those choices, and I think we have more. I think the U.S. has more friends on this issue than China does, and we need to as well address this from a multilateral and collective perspective.
Recently, the Trump administration did announce sanctions on 14 members of the National People's Congress Standing Committee, which includes asset freezes and travel bans. And this was taken in response to the ongoing crackdown in Hong Kong and, as you mentioned, the imposition of the national security laws. And of course, the NPC is Congress's counterpart organization. So I wanted to ask specifically what you think of that action. And whether you think that will in any way affect your interactions with the Chinese going forward. And do you think this was an appropriate action? Is this the kind of thing we should be doing? Is it mostly symbolic, or do you think it's more than that?
Well, it's going to be mostly symbolic until the Chinese ban me from travel to China. That'll be much less symbolic. And the only thing stopping me right now from traveling to China is COVID-19 and the issues around that. And it's half joking on that, but I think that if we're going to get to a point where the U.S. and China are in fact trying to work through this era of where we're competing, but there's areas where we need to cooperate, then banning travel among leaders like those in the standing committee probably isn't a good idea, because these are the folks who we need to talk to them. They need to talk to us. I know the MPC is a rubber stamp, but I do know that they're also communicators with others in the Chinese leadership, and we need to have the opportunity to tell them what we think. And I always tell folks, I've been to China 11 times, and a few of my colleagues criticize me for going that many times. But I tell them, it's like, you get to stand outside the room and yell at China. I'm inside the room yelling at the Chinese leaders who need to hear it from us. We're better off being in the room across the table, literally across the table from each other, being frank and honest and open in these discussions than lobbying press releases or, for me, reading China Daily to read what they, really think of the United States. I'd rather be one-on-one or, 5-on-5 or however many folks we can get over there to talk to them directly. And so travel bans like this kind of get in the way of continuing those discussions and those debates.
I'll give you a question from one of our viewers. So Ray Harasan from Marubeni America Corporation asks, how does Congress generally frame the U.S. China competition? Is it Cold War 2.0 with the resulting end state producing a winner and a loser? Or is it about finding a sustainable state of coexistence? So as you said, there's multiple views in Congress. Yeah. But how would you respond to that question?
Thanks. Generally, I don't sense that Congress, as a collective group, we don't categorize it as Cold War 2.0. I think it's some of your viewers may not understand this reference, but a few years back on the Halloween episode of Saturday Night Live, Tom Hanks played this character called David S. Pumpkins, and it was quite a swept the cultural milieu here in the United States for a couple of weeks. And he said at one point in the skit, he goes, "I'm my own thing." And I think that's probably the way to describe this U.S.-China relationship. It's its own thing. It's not a Cold War 2.0. It has its own dynamics. Obviously, the leaders are very different as well. There is a level of competition to it, but I think with two countries that are so integrated to each other, and two countries that are so integrated in the global economy, just to start, it really doesn't lend itself to the Cold War 2.0. So I think I would just say it's its own thing without getting too far into trying to describe it, exactly how to characterize it. I know what it isn't, but trying to define what it is these days, it's not going well. That's enough.
So we have a question from Charles Kimball from the Korea Center for International Finance.
Yeah, sure.
And he wants to know whether you can address the issue of China's growing role in Latin America and what the U.S. is doing to counter it and expand our influence. Is that something that you personally, your office, or other members of Congress are paying attention to?
Yeah, other members are paying attention to that. I obviously do track that, but I think they're going to see with our incoming chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Gregory Meeks from New York City. He's the incoming chair, and he has talked about the U.S. role in Latin America more as a partner than anything, and trying to ensure that we up our game there. And this gets into the broader question too of the Belt Road Initiative and whether the United States or the U.S. and its allies and partners have an alternative, not a $1-for-$1 alternative to the BRI. I don't think that's going to be possible, but we don't need that as much as we need to have a plan to have presence, a plan to be there. And this would apply in countries in Africa. It would apply to regions like Latin America as well. And we've put some pieces in place. We need to fund those pieces. We have the Export-Import Bank. We've changed OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, through legislation recently to create through actually some of the help from some of your colleagues at CSIS as well. So I think it's a matter of upping our game so that the U.S. is seen as being more of a partner. Our challenge is we don't run U.S. Incorporated, and I think that's a big challenge to counter the BRI, because China as a country, as a government, its policy, it's basically taking its industrial policy and trying to export that model a little bit. But we don't do that. We actually we use the private investment markets usually lead on investment for in the United States, and we want to use that model. But the U.S. government can be a facilitator and enabler of companies, and we need to do a better job on that. So that's how we're thinking about that.
So one last question from Collins Chung from the University of Malaya. The race for technological edge, especially in the spheres of quantum and 5G and AI, has been increasingly putting the U.S. and its superiority, I don't know if that's the right word, but our edge in these areas under tremendous challenge and pressure. So what is the U.S. doing? What should we do to ensure that the advantage basically is still in the direction of the United States? And I would add to that question, since you just referred to industrial strategies. Do you think that we should be developing more in the United States? Is this the right response to compete with China's industrial policies?
Yeah, thanks. I think the first thing is we just need to declare that we're going to lead. We need to set those aggressive goals. For instance, I think about the Chinese leadership officially says, they want to lead in AI, be the world leader in AI in 2030. And our response in the United States has been to, pull our hair out. I think our response ought to be to say, fine, well, you'll be behind us because we're going to be leading by 2029. Right? We should just set the goals and start doing these things, taking the actions we need to take to continue our technological edge. The National Defense Bill, which we've passed in the House and the Senate over the last week, the president said he's going to veto it over unrelated issues. If he does, we will override it. And that National Defense Bill has the CHIPS Act in it. The CHIPS Act is a separate piece of legislation folded into the defense bill that makes a serious United States investment in semiconductors, which is a foundational technology for a lot of what has to happen to maintain a lead in technology. So we're taking action there. I have legislation, it's law now, where we're expanding the education in the Defense Department about AI, what artificial intelligence is, what it isn't. We're not trying to create 2.2 million coders as much as we're just trying to be sure that we have a model where we're educating people. What is AI? Why is it important? And this is a model based on what Finland has done. So there are big things we need to do. There are little things we need to do, but we are not going to, as some have suggested, even in the United States, surprisingly have suggested that the U.S. sort of just nationalize some of this stuff. And, I'm a Democrat, but I'm a capitalist. We are not going to be nationalizing large parts of our economy. We are going to do it the way we've always done it, but there are opportunities to work with like-minded partners, like-minded allies who support transparency and openness in markets as a different model. But we need to get started on that because that race has already started.
That's great. I really appreciate all of your really thoughtful remarks and the hard work that you are doing in Congress for America and hopefully to help us manage the U.S.-China relationship going forward. We do have a few other questions, but I'm afraid that we have run out of time. And I know that you have work that you have to get to. So Thank you so much, Congressman Larsen, for joining us today for the last session of the 2020 China Power Debates.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, and thank you to everyone at CSIS. Appreciate it. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you too. Well, we're now going to turn to our fifth and final debate, and I'm joined by Rebecca Fannin and Matt Turpin, and I'm going to introduce them in just a minute. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the topic of our debate today. The proposition is selective U.S. China economic decoupling will set back China's emergence as a global high-tech leader. The Trump administration has tightened restrictions on exports to leading Chinese telecom and semiconductor companies. And the measures are intended to prevent U.S. exports from aiding the Chinese military or helping China in its effort to undermine democracies. In addition, the United States has taken measures to encourage American companies to diversify their production and supply chains in order to reduce reliance on China. Given the interconnectedness of the global economy, these efforts could pose a challenge to the competitiveness of Chinese tech firms and manufacturers. To limit the negative impact on China, Beijing is encouraging the pursuit of self-reliance in key technologies and prioritizing technological innovation as a core driver of economic growth. And this past October, the Communist Party leadership has agreed to a new 5-year plan. Actually, I think it was just last month, which puts scientific and technological innovation at the heart of China's modernization program, which, of course, has the goal of making China into a global leader in innovation by 2035. That was an objective that was set out by Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress. So before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to ask our viewers to cast your votes, either for or against the proposition, which again is selective U.S. China economic decoupling will set back China's emergence as a global high-tech leader. For those of you who've joined us for prior debates, you know how to vote, but I'll explain it for those who might be joining us for the first time. You can either vote with your phone, and if you do, you text to 22333. You text the word China Power, and you'll get a text back that tells you that you've joined the session, and then you text A if you disagree, and B, A if you agree, sorry, and B if you disagree with the proposition. Alternatively, you can use your computer. You can go to pollev.com/China Power, and the proposition will be on your screen, and you can just click the button for agree or disagree. And of course, this information is displayed on the screen on the slide. And so hopefully you can all vote. We will vote again after our debate one final time. And so now that while everybody is voting, I'm going to introduce our speakers. So today we have joining us arguing for the proposition is Matt Turpin. And Matt is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution doing research on economic statecraft and technology innovation. He's also a senior advisor at Palantir Technologies, and he was previously a senior advisor for China at the U.S. Department of Commerce and a director for China at the National Security Council. Arguing against the proposition is Rebecca Fannin. She's founder of Silicon Dragon Ventures, and she's also a special correspondent for CNBC and writes a weekly column for Forbes. Ms. Fannin is author of Silicon Dragon, How China is Winning the Tech Race, and also author of Tech Titans of China. So there we have it. We have two fantastic experts to debate our proposition today, which is selective U.S. China economic decoupling will set back China's emergence as a global high-tech leader. So let's put up the results of our poll and see what we have. 57% agree. Now it's dropping a little bit, 55% to 45%. Just about 10% discrepancy between the two. And we'll take maybe just another 10 seconds while people can add the votes. It takes a little bit of time to get into the system, so I want to give everybody a chance to vote. And then in a minute, I'm going to show you the results of a Twitter poll, which we conducted over the last 4 days in advance of this debate. And it's a little different than these results, but not too far off. So I think we'll close the voting here. We have 54% agreeing and 46% disagreeing. And we'll show you the results of our Twitter poll, which had 65.5% agreeing and 34.5% disagreeing. So a little bit more tilted in the direction of agreeing with the proposition. But both polls here among our viewers live and also on our Twitter poll had more people agreeing with the proposition than disagreeing with the proposition. So I think we'll have an interesting discussion today. I'll just quickly review over the next hour plus, about an hour and 10 minutes, how our event is going to run. Both speakers will have a maximum of 15 minutes to present their initial remarks. After they make their arguments, each will have 5 minutes to respond to the other speaker. And then we're going to take questions from our viewers. And please, if you send in questions, send questions that are directly pertinent to the proposition so that the answers will enrich the debate and help our understanding of the arguments. And then following that Q&A, we'll quickly do a final poll. And I hope that all of you will stay with us to the end so that you can cast your votes after listening to the entire debate. If you want to submit a question, you can click on the Ask Live Questions button on the CSIS page for this event. And if you are having problems finding that button, you can email your question to hprice@csis.org. That's HPRICE@csis.org. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Fannin, who is going to argue for the proposition that we have before us today. No, she's arguing against. Sorry, we're going to go with Matt first. I always go with the for first, so my apologies. We're going to start with Matt Turpin, who is arguing that selective U.S. China economic decoupling will set back China's emergence as a global high-tech leader. Over to you, Matt.
Well, Bonnie, that would have been a really interesting set of arguments. It would have been a fun time to switch it up right at the last minute. So, yeah. Bonnie, thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this debate. It's a real honor to join and take part in this last debate in a series that I think has been absolutely spectacular. So my hat's off to you and the whole CSIS team for putting together, I think, a really quality series. Despite all the unique, conditions that we're obviously all find ourselves in. I'm joining you from my basement home office in Northwest DC, which I'm sure for many of the viewers out there, they're in similar conditions during these sort of unique times that we're all enduring. I feel sort of vastly underqualified given the women and men who have represented various sides during these debates. So I'm going to do my best in what is bound to be, I think, an interesting discussion, especially given the expertise that Rebecca brings to this issue. So we're here to debate the proposition selective U.S. China economic decoupling will set back China's emergence as a global high-tech leader. When Bonnie first contacted me about participating in this debate, what struck me was that the proposition seemed a bit odd, at least to me, because in many important ways, across a number of strategic industries, the United States and the PRC are not coupled. I'd remind everyone that when Niall Ferguson and Moritz Schoeselberg coined the term Chimerica back in 2007, that was largely a play on words, right? That coupling of the U.S. and the PRC economies was a chimera in many important ways, and I think that often colors our understanding of what is sort of actually happening across our economies in a broad and important way. For decades, the United States and other like-minded countries have actively denied Beijing access to the manufacturing know-how and the critical components needed to become a global leader in various high-tech industries. This is well established. It's been happening for decades, and it continues to remain in place. Through a combination of multilateral dual-use export controls on defense articles and defense services, on internationally aligned investment security regulations, restrictions on access to R&D, the PRC has been set back in their emergence as a global high-tech leader. In fact, in a number of strategic industries, the PRC remains 2 or more generations behind the global cutting-edge leadership. The failure to even achieve parity is not due to any fault of Chinese researchers and scientists, right? Or the inherent weaknesses of the PRC's political system. It is due almost entirely to the fact that the United States and a number of other countries have made it incredibly hard for the PRC to catch up in a number of these areas through this concerted effort across both public and private sectors to deny the PRC cutting-edge technology that would allow them to come to parity. These conditions and policies are unlikely to change given the worsening geopolitical relationship with the PRC and other democracies around the world. And so let's take real quick what I would think is a look at 2 examples of industry sectors where this has played out and continues to play out. The manufacture of advanced aircraft and the manufacture of advanced semiconductors. 2 sectors that the United States and other advanced economies identify as dual-use sectors that have broad impacts on both national security and economic prosperity. I'd remind everyone that both the manufacture of commercial aircraft and semiconductors are the 2nd and 3rd most valuable manufactured U.S. exports, and play integral roles into the United States' qualitative military advantage that it remains over its adversaries and potential adversaries. And these are also 2 sectors that the PRC for decades has identified as areas that they seek to become a global leader in. Efforts that to date have failed. So let's take a look at sort of the aviation and aerospace sector. I'd encourage all the viewers to watch an excellent piece by our CSIS colleague, Scott Kennedy, that aired just a week ago, a video that's posted on YouTube titled China's Stalled Aircraft Dreams. The PRC has been trying for nearly 50 years to create an advanced commercial aviation industry. And for 50 years, that has failed. If we look back at the Unsure program of the 1970s, this failed to produce commercial aircraft of quality that can compete on the world stage. In the 1980s, Chinese state-owned enterprises joined with McDonnell Douglas to produce a globally competitive commercial aircraft. That deal collapsed after concerns that the technology was being diverted to the PLA's military programs for aircraft production. And in this decade, really in the last 2 decades, we've watched as COMAC has sought to create a competitive regional aircraft called the C919 that is still way behind schedule and has not yet achieved the goals that the PRC has laid out. So why hasn't the PRC been able to achieve its long-sought goals of technology leadership in this important, both economically important and national security important sector of aviation and aerospace? It's because the United States and other advanced economies have effectively remained uncoupled from the PRC through the combination of the policies and regulations that I described earlier. For instance, in the U.S. Export Administration regulations, it is under Category 9 that aerospace and propulsion are restricted from access by the PRC, and has been so significantly since 1989, when both the United States, the Europeans, and the Japanese all placed increased export controls on militarily relevant technologies in the wake of the Tiananmen massacre. Those regulations hit multiple segments of a highly complex industry that requires exquisite systems integration to be able to create world competitive aircraft. For example, the design and manufacture of advanced turbojet engines, which is an integral part of creating any sort of domestic aviation industry, still remains beyond the bounds of what the PRC is able to put together. And the design, manufacture, and integration of advanced avionics, right, essentially the operating system for aircraft, continue to remain beyond the PRC's ability to be able to make happen. Despite hundreds of billions of dollars of investment and comprehensive cyber and traditional espionage campaigns, the PRC remains at least 2 generations behind in jet aircraft engine production. GE, Pratt Whitney, Safran, and Rolls-Royce all continue to sell completed engines to the PRC, but remain unwilling to share their know-how in order to gain market access. It's simply they are willing to provide the complete engines, but are unwilling for their own business reasons, and because of regulations that are placed on them by their home countries, to turn over the know-how to how to create those engines. The same plays out in the realm of advanced avionics, with US and European companies willing to provide some components, but continue to withhold the key components to be able to allow the PRC to build out its own domestic industry. We can also take a look at the same situation in the semiconductor industry. For decades, the PRC has sought to become, on par with the United States, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Europe on the creation of advanced semiconductors. And despite hundreds of billions of investments, right, and efforts across sort of multiple sectors, the PRC still remains well behind US manufacturing of advanced semiconductors. That is unlikely to change in the near future, and the United States is likely to continue to use the regulations and policies to deny the PRC the ability to make progress in those areas. And so maybe I'll end with this closing thought as you all consider the proposition. The United States remains uncoupled from the PRC in several key high-tech industries, and that uncoupled relationship is unlikely to change. Through a comprehensive set of policies and regulations, the United States largely shares with other advanced economies. The PRC has been unable to emerge in these areas as a high-tech leader, and will likely continue to remain behind in those areas. And so for that reason, I think it is advisable to accept the proposition that continued selective decoupling will continue to set back China's emergence as a high-tech leader. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. We're now going to turn to Rebecca Fannin to argue against the proposition. Once again, the proposition is selective U.S. China economic decoupling will set back China's emergence as a global high-tech leader. Rebecca?
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks for the invitation to speak here today and to debate with Matt. And Matt, I look forward to meeting you someday, and Bonnie as well. So thank you everyone. I have been reporting about China technology from a Silicon Valley perspective for 15 years and have made endless trips to China as a journalist and also as part of the whole tech ecosystem, hosting events in Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen. So I do know it well from a close-up perspective and also from a journalistic perspective as a writer and an author. My first book, which Bonnie mentioned before, Silicon Dragon, was published in 2008. It was an early read on what was happening in China's tech development. And Silicon Dragon, how China is winning the tech race, was very early, but we have seen it develop, this Silicon Valley to Silicon Dragon develop with technology in the forefront, innovations in the forefront. And today, we can point to a number of indicators of China's rise, which are the root of this whole decoupling issue, because we have seen China rise so quickly over the past 15 years or so in innovations, from a copycat nation, which was accused of, copying Facebook, copying Apple, copying Google, copying Amazon, to now today much more in-depth technology innovation that was not there not that long ago. So my point is that China has risen very, very quickly. We've seen Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent come up and become giants in industry in their fields and morph into many other fields beyond their core function. So these have become super apps, giant companies that have global influence. We've seen the rise of a second generation of Chinese technology companies. These are companies like ByteDance, the maker of TikTok. We have seen China emerge in AI. This is one of the sectors that China has been highlighting as for growth. We've seen China emerge in robotics. We've seen China become the world's second largest venture capital investor, right behind the US. And in fact, at one point, China was ahead of the US in venture capital spending. And why is venture capital spending important? It's because it funds the startups that have the leading edge technologies. We've seen China emerge faster in R&D than the US. We've seen China talk about and start to develop 6G, where the US is still behind in many of these areas, behind China. And China has caught up very quickly. And I think China's rise is really unstoppable. If you look at a number of areas, such as just the sheer determination of the Chinese entrepreneurs and the sheer ambition and the assertiveness of the people and the increased confidence of the people that, yes, we can do it. We are on the world stage now. And I think it's really unstoppable. And we are looking at this long-term trend. I think China has become less reliant on the US. We've seen companies like Huawei. When we have tried to put restrictions on Chinese tech companies, well, the result is that it reinforces them to say, okay, we're going to do it more our way over and over again. So Huawei comes up with its own chips development. It's part of this whole assertiveness, this whole increasing confidence that we see out of China today. We've seen Chinese companies going global today on the global stage, which was not the case 15, 20 years ago. Companies from China going into Southeast Asia, where, okay, well, if the US says you can't come in and invest in our companies, then China has turned to Southeast Asia. China has turned to Africa. China is having a very big impact in the tech development of Southeast Asia, investing very heavily, bringing its own technologies in, bringing its own companies into these areas. And it's creating a bigger sphere of influence throughout Asia. If you talk about supply chains, this has been an issue that the U.S. is saying, well, you need to come up with new ways of supplies beyond China. Well, I don't think that that's going to change overnight. I think companies cannot get the components that they need from other markets that China does supply. So this is not going to happen overnight. I don't think we're going to see this reshoring implication. If you look, I mentioned the venture capital spending a little bit a while ago. So we have now seen what's happening is a shift from this U.S. and China. We're seeing much more power and money going directly into China from venture capitalists that are homegrown, that are domestically oriented. And this is contributing to this rise of these tech innovators in China. We've seen the U.S. push back about listing, going public on NASDAQ and the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, in the New York Stock Exchange. Well, the result is that we're now seeing more and more listings going to China, going to Hong Kong. So I think this pushback strategy is not working. It's actually making China more powerful, more reliant on its own know-how. I think, this threat that we see, this decoupling that we see is actually just making China stronger. And I think another aspect of this is how China has handled the whole COVID situation. China is coming out of this faster than the US, and its economy is growing strong, is coming out of it faster. The economy is coming out of it faster because China, cracked down on restrictions, wearing masks, contact tracing, all this. China, you could argue about the methods, but it worked. And now China is emerging stronger as a result and faster as a result. We mentioned the new economic plan, the 5-year plan. Well, this 5-year plan, a lot of it is about innovation, and a lot of it is about developing China's semiconductor business. So I've actually visited some Chinese semiconductor companies and toured them. And I know that the US has the lead there, and Taiwan and Korea have the lead there, but mainland China is determined to catch up within 5 to 10 years. So we are looking at a long-term horizon here. I think China has shown how far it has come ahead in such a short time in many, many areas. And also many of these technology innovations in China today, they're used a lot more than they are here in the US. For instance, self-driving, autonomous driving. It's much more widespread in China. It hasn't really taken off yet in the US. Electric vehicles, another area. Robotics, another area. AI, another area. All these sectors in China tech today are advancing much more rapidly than they are in the US. Not to mention the infrastructure issues, where if you go to places in, in Rust Belt cities in the US, you're going to see a lot of potholes. You're going to see a lot of rehab that's needed. Where you go to China today, it's all starting from brand new. And so the cities today, the infrastructure today in China is really remarkable. And I think the US by comparison needs work. So I think I'll leave it there, and thank you for listening.
We now turn back to you, Matt, for 5 minutes of any responsive comments you would like to make to Rebecca, and then we'll go back and let Rebecca have 5 minutes as well.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie and Rebecca. So, first I'd start off with, I completely agree with Rebecca's point about the determination and confidence of Chinese entrepreneurs, of Chinese venture capitalists, of certainly their scientists and researchers. They have much to be proud of. They have much to celebrate in terms of the progress they've made. But I would also offer that sort of determination and kind of confidence is often not enough to sort of compete in many of the areas in which the PRC is still well far behind. And so, and I'd like to sort of touch on sort of two areas that you brought up. The first would be sort of the field of AI, right? And the field of AI is largely sort of segmented out into sort of four main components that would go into sort of AI leadership, right? That's access to sort of quality data. It's access to the sort of human capital that understands how to develop and implement and innovate in AI. And it's access, number three is access to sort of the algorithms. And then last is the AI chipsets, right? The semiconductors that make up the chipsets that allow for those functions to be able to run. In the first three, the PRC has enormous advantages and is absolutely in a position to be able to challenge the United States. They have, given the government's ability to control, they are able to gain access to data in ways that is very difficult for the United States to be able to do. They have incredibly high quality human capital and researchers that work in this field, right? And the algorithms, to be honest, are largely sort of available worldwide, right? These are things that are largely available through worldwide. However, when we get to that last component, right, the idea of AI chipsets, this goes back to the point I was making about the PRC semiconductor industry. And if I were to sort of segue into sort of a comment you made about Huawei Technologies, just in August, Huawei announced that they would be building new 45 nanometer and 28 nanometer wafer fabs to be able to supply them with US free chips. And that may sound sort of spectacular, right? And then Huawei may complete those factories within the next year or two. But when they do complete them, they will have cutting edge 2002 technology, right? They will not have cutting edge sort of world leading technology and advanced chipsets, right? Samsung is developing its own 5 nanometer chipsets, right? US companies consistently operate at sort of the sub 14 space. US manufacturing of specialized chipsets, not only for AI, but for example, field programmable gate arrays, right? The United States remains the sole producer of field programmable gate arrays, which is the key component in 5G base stations that makes it very difficult for Huawei to be able to sell its networking equipment, given the restrictions on that the United States has placed on Huawei. And so, I would just offer that there are a number of technical aspects that make it very difficult for the PRC to achieve its goals that they've had for decades and have spent hundreds of billions of dollars on and have not yet reached, while the rest of the world continues to march forward in terms of innovation. And so they have a difficult problem of one, catching up to the current level, but the net current level is not staying static. And they have a continuing difficult level to be able to sort of move forward. The idea that the United States and other countries could continue to place controls and make it difficult through remaining uncoupled is likely to remain and likely to continue to be a major problem that the PRC is going to have trouble overcoming. Thank you.
Rebecca, 5 minutes for your response.
Well, my main point is that our pushback and this decoupling is actually making China more determined than ever to push forward with these leading technologies. And it's not just in semiconductors, it's in supercomputers, it's in mobile internet, it's in cloud computing, it's in all the areas that these fields touch: healthcare, manufacturing, finance, big data. robotics, biotech. Many of these areas have been spotlighted by China for development, and they are moved ahead very aggressively in getting these technologies into these sectors. So I think our attempts to push China back are actually having the opposite effect, in that China is spending more money, state-led money and private money, to get ahead and to not only catch up to the US, but surpass the US. And on the AI front, I'm going to point to Kai-Fu Lee's book about where he says that basically it's a very close race and China's coming up very, very quickly. And I would agree with that. And then China is ahead of the US in implementing AI into many industries, like I mentioned before, such as healthcare and finance. And so I think we're at a turning point now where this wasn't so much of an issue, say even a decade ago, but it has become a very major issue now. And I would call it a tech war, or a cold tech war, in that China has risen so quickly that the US feels threatened. And that's why that's the whole root of this decoupling situation. And I just think that it's unstoppable. I think that China's rise is unstoppable.
We're now going to turn to the Q&A portion of our debate, and we've gotten some good questions. So Rebecca, I'll start with you. You mentioned in your last set of comments, the private sector. So we have a question from Paul Bell from the University of Oklahoma. And he asks, given that China's rise as a high-tech innovator has been driven by primarily, of course, the private sector, what do you think will be the effect of the emerging initiatives of the party to exert more control over private companies, and especially its recent effort to slap down Alibaba and Tencent?
Right. Well, the Alibaba effort on the IPO, yes. If you're in China, you're doing business, you have to make friends with the government, and I've interviewed Jack Ma at Alibaba, and look, he knows that. He said that to me, and I think that this is not going to set back Tencent and Alibaba. That it's an accepted way of doing business in China. It's not maybe something that we're used to here in the US, but that's the way it is in China. And the leaders of those companies know it.
But more broadly, the policies toward the private sector, do you think that that will inhibit China's development of high tech going forward, that the preferential policies are being aimed really at the state-owned enterprises?
You're saying you're talking Alibaba, Tencent.
Well, those were examples, but I think the broader question was about policies in China that are hampering the private sector from gaining access, for example, to capital relative to state-owned companies. And yet the private sector has been the source of much of innovation and growth in the Chinese economy. So will this hamper China's ambition to become a global high-tech power if they are implementing policies that are not favorable to the private sector?
Okay, well, so Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, the way that they were funded originally was through international venture capital. And they are now listed companies. And I think that any state-led efforts to influence them more is not going to hinder their technology innovation progress. I just don't see that happening.
Okay. Matt, next question for you. You talked about China's aircraft sector, and particularly engines. And we have a question from Steve Schinkel at the U.S. Naval War College. And he says that China is making progress in regards to re-engineering the Y-20 transport with high bypass turbofan engines, and that this may have implications for its commercial aircraft production, because these are engines that are apparently used in air transportation. He says that this is a concern for both the European Union and the US, and is connected to the Made in China 2025 project. So how he asks, how should sort of like-minded democracies and aircraft producers, aircraft engine producers respond? Should we cooperate? Should we compete? And I guess I could extend this, that if we cut ourselves off from the cooperation, does that end up slowing China down, or do we negatively in any way impact our own development?
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. And just a quick plug on kind of the last question. Yeah, I'd encourage viewers to go pick up Nick Lardy's book, The State Strikes Back: The End of Economic Reform in China. I mean, he describes sort of in detail what he thinks will be the impacts of Xi Jinping's significant preference over state-owned enterprises, the reemergence of state-owned enterprises, and sort of the hobbling of private industry that has done so much to move. The progress we've seen has largely been driven by the state by the private sector, and that Xi Jinping's actions are sort of the opposite of that, which would suggest that this will continue to be very problematic. In terms of jet engine production that we're seeing sort of from the PLA for the Y-20, I think certainly this is an area that the United States and the Europeans and others are going to have to watch. I think it still remains to be seen whether these advances will kind of go into full production and be able to compete on the same level that sort of we watch the ability of GE and Safran and Pratt Whitney to be able to produce at scale, to be able to operate for thousands of hours with very minimal maintenance. I'm not yet convinced that some of the things that we're seeing yet suggest that they are at full sort of production, right? So it does remain to be seen, and I think certainly for the United States and other countries, it would encourage that they would, that the way forward is to consider many of the techniques that they've been using in the past, which is, cooperation on multilateral export control regimes like the Wassenaar Arrangement, as a way to coordinate their efforts to be able to deny significant dual-use technologies to an industry sector that has obviously both significant commercial implications, but also significant military implications. These are systems and procedures that are well established, and so it is highly likely that the United States and other countries will continue to utilize those venues of multilateral export control coordination as a place to be able to continue to do that. And I just would remind everyone that the PRC is not inside those regimes, right? So the PRC is outside those multilateral export control regimes. And therefore, it is highly likely the United States will continue to use them effectively.
Our next question I'd like to ask is about the importance of espionage in China's high-tech development. And we know that the Department of Justice has been focused in its China initiative to really try and stop some of the efforts by China to steal high-tech technology. So I wanted to start by asking Rebecca whether espionage, you think, is still important in China's high-tech development, and that if the United States is more successful in cutting off that particular source of high technology, do you think that that will have a major impact?
Well, if you look at I'm here in Silicon Valley, and we have seen a number of Chinese companies come into the electric vehicle market with R&D facilities here in California. So if you take the electric vehicle market as an example, I think we have seen some instances there where we have seen security threats and theft of property, and we have seen some lawsuits come out of that. And so I think that this is actually becoming less of an issue today in some sectors like this, because the Chinese are not investing heavily like they were before in the U.S. technology companies. Before, there was tremendous amount of investment by the leading Chinese tech companies into our cutting edge technology companies here in the U.S. Now that this has been stopped, I think that whole spying issue, at least within technology of the U.S. companies, could diminish actually. And I think I've seen this in the electrical vehicle market, where basically now China has put more emphasis on within its own market of developing the technologies needed to make electrical vehicles a reality.
Matt, do you want to comment on the role of espionage in China's development of high technology and how important you think it is going forward?
Well, I think that it continues to remain an important part of the PRC's sort of overall technology competition strategy, right? It remains an integral part. The combination of sort of traditional espionage, cyber-enabled espionage. I'd remind everyone of the case of sort of the combined MSS, sort of human espionage and cyber espionage case against Safran and GE's own sort of program to provide the LEP engine, LEP aircraft engine to COMAC. In the building of the C919, right? This is, a campaign that was underway for years, that has been prosecuted by the U.S. Justice Department. There are a number of individuals that are in jail now that were MSS operatives that were involved with this, as well as indictments on others that have not entered the United States. So I think this continues to remain an important element of the PRC's broader strategy, particularly as these sort of combined investment screening, export controls, restrictions on R&D access remain in place. Espionage in both a traditional and cyber sense remains an important aspect of that, and will continue to be so as long as the U.S. And other sort of democracies remain uncoupled in many of these strategic sectors.
We've gotten a few questions about Taiwan, and so maybe I can just sort of try to roll these together. One is from Shen Jiaming from an NGO in Taiwan, and another one from Tom DeHuddy from Brandywine Global. And it's essentially, these questions are about what kind of role Taiwan plays in the era of economic decoupling. How will Taiwan affect whether China can become a global high-tech leader? And we know that China has sourced, many of China's companies have sourced their supply of semiconductors from companies like TSMC, and others in Taiwan. And at least under the Trump administration, there has been an effort to try and curtail those supplies to China. So what is really the role of Taiwan in this economic decoupling going forward? Is it potentially decisive? Maybe I'll start with you, Matt.
Sure. Obviously in the field of sort of the global market for semiconductors, Taiwan is perhaps one of the most critical locations with the most advanced fabs in the world, whether it's from TSMC or UMC. These companies continue to provide the sort of the contract manufacturing for design firms that are in the United States that produce some of the most advanced semiconductors in the world, right? I think obviously it is in the interest of Taiwan's government in order to and the companies in Taiwan to continue to maintain their leadership and deny the know-how and the manufacturing specifics to companies that might replace them, right? So there are plenty of self-interest reasons of why Taiwanese companies would continue to sell their finished products, right, which are electronics components, right? That's what semiconductors are. They would continue to sell those to the manufacturers of electronics, on the east coast of China, but they don't want to be replaced, right? So they're going to continue to withhold and deny, aspects of sort of the know-how and their own supply chains from moving to the PRC. Now, the PRC would love to replace Taiwan, that vulnerability from their own supply chains, but desiring to replace that and actually making it happen are kind of two different things. And to date, that's been very difficult for the PRC to do. I completely understand and agree with Rebecca's assertion that the PRC is more determined, but necessarily being more determined, I don't know if that necessarily changes some of the underlying conditions that would continue to make it very difficult for them to achieve those outcomes.
Rebecca, what are your thoughts on the Taiwan factor?
Yeah, and I would just say it's not just the determination; it's the capital and the scientific know-how that's behind it. So you can be determined, but you have to have a lot of other ingredients as well. And I think China does have that. On the Taiwan situation, I visited SMIC in a semiconductor company in Shanghai. And when the CEO was from Taiwan, and I remember covering Asian venture capital in the early days when actually the majority of it stemmed from Taiwan, but it moved to mainland China. And so we've seen talent and money flow in tech and in venture capital and in the semiconductor market from Taiwan into mainland Chinese companies. And so you can't really, it's hard to stop that talent flow.
So let me ask you both a question about whether U.S. efforts to hamper China's or slow China's development in high tech, what we're referring to here in our proposition is efforts to implement selective economic decoupling, whether that will have any negative impact on the United States. I think there are some people who believe that by trying to constrain China's development, that there will be some backlash on high-tech development in the United States. So I'd like to hear how both of you would respond to that statement. So Rebecca, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I would certainly argue that both sides can benefit by collaboration and cooperation. Certainly, that's not what we're seeing today. And I think we could lose out by not tapping into resources that advance technology and advance it not in a nationalistic way, but in an international way. I think we're in a losing situation. The world is in a losing situation if U.S. and China don't begin to work together on some of the areas that were actually being worked on together in the past, but now have decoupled. And I do think the U.S. Could lose out, and the world could lose out on innovation and advances in technology with this decoupling that's going on.
Matt, your perspective?
Yeah, I think it is obvious there are costs and downsides to a less efficient sort of set of economic relationships, right? And certainly controls on exports, dual-use exports, controls and screening of investments, restrictions on access to R&D, create frictions in a broader economic system, right? But again, those aren't the only costs that we would have to consider, right? So, I mean, the costs of higher prices, less efficient allocation of capital are certainly costs to consider. But there are also costs in terms of national security and the ability to continue to maintain, productive and important parts of your own economy, as well as, as Rob Atkinson, the president of ITIF, has laid out. And I think I recommend all viewers to take a look at his piece called "Innovation Drag: China's Impact on Developed Nations," looks at the impacts to broader global innovation that comes from the kinds of economic practices that the PRC follows, right? And so, I think it is important that we not discount the other costs that come from the status quo system that the PRC's economic model perpetuates, right? So, we can look at the costs that come from actions on our part to introduce frictions into the economic system that would slow down their development, right? But there are also costs from the actions that they've been taking to our own economies, right? If we take a look back at the commission that President Obama put together in 2013, the Blair-Huntsman Commission on intellectual property, the findings by the two chairmen, Dennis Blair, Admiral Dennis Blair, and former Director of National Intelligence, and Governor/Ambassador John Huntsman, looked at costs of $300 to $400 billion a year to the U.S. economy at intellectual property theft that comes from the process of the kinds of activities that the PRC is doing, right? And so we have to, I think, look at the costs on sort of both sides of that. And I think far too often, the loudest voices are about the costs on one side of the ledger and not the costs on the other side of the ledger. And that's, I think, what's important for us to take in mind and reflects why the sets of decisions that the U.S. government in a bipartisan way are pursuing in terms of continuing to remain uncoupled in key strategic sectors.
Right. Well, it seems that the U.S. could do a better job of picking its targets. For instance, going after TikTok, going after WeChat. I don't think TikTok is too much of a security threat.
Anything else that you'd like to say on that particular question, Rebecca?
Well, I already mentioned, I already had argued in this case, but I just wanted to add in that to Matt's point about the security issues, it seems like we're going after the wrong targets. To go after TikTok and WeChat, that's not going to make much difference in the technology innovation race.
Well,
TikTok is a consumer app, and we put so much attention on going at make it such a high-profile issue, and then drop it basically.
I would also argue that it is certainly not unreasonable to expect that social media platforms are venues of political influence. It's an argument we've certainly made for a number of other social media platforms, right? So a social media platform that resides within a state that exercises near total control over information flows, it's not unreasonable to expect that that is a national security issue, given all the arguments we've made about social media platforms in the context of Russian interference operations inside the United States. I would also offer that places like the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto have been documenting for years the censorship and influence that both WeChat and TikTok have been exhibiting upon their user base in multiple democracies around the world. And so it is, in fact, I think, it is not the case that these are sort of undocumented national security risks, or in fact, the documentation is actually quite well established. I would agree with you that some of the actions and techniques that were used to address these things have not gone particularly well. That I will absolutely concede that to you. But to say that these are not areas of national security concern, I would argue that well, then we shouldn't be concerned about how Facebook is operating or anything else. So,
all right. Well, who are the users of TikTok? The users of TikTok are here. TikTok is set up separately as a separate app from the Chinese app, the Chinese equivalent. So you're talking about the users. You're talking about it's user-generated content.
Right, but the algorithms have been shown to block and censor politically sensitive things to the PRC government.
Within the PRC.
And in the United States, Australia, Europe, and other places.
Okay, we're going to move on to another question. We have a great question, I think, from Avery Goldstein at the University of Pennsylvania. And, he's trying to get to the issue of why in some areas of technology, although, of course, Rebecca's right that China's made enormous strides in many areas of technology, that there are some sectors, some technologies where China has failed to catch up or make the breakthroughs that they wanted. And so he really asked, why have they failed in the areas that they have failed? And if the answer is export controls, does that necessarily mean they will continue to fail in the future? But if you think that export controls is not the primary reason, then I'd be interested in hearing your assessment of why you think that China has failed in some of these key areas. So Matt, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, so if we were to take sort of the other side of that argument, let's take a look at sort of high-speed rail, right? As an example of an area that the PRC has done particularly well and now holds sort of a global leadership position in terms of the creation of sort of high-speed rail systems as an industry sector. I would remind us all that is not an area that falls underneath sort of globally understood dual-use export control regimes, right? It's certainly an area of valuable economic prosperity to Japan and Germany, who are world leaders or who have been world leaders in those industry sectors. But when you look at the actual the broader system of dual-use export controls and investment screening criteria that countries around the world, including the United States, have used to look at for things that have impacts on national security, the development of high-speed rail has not been an area of that. And so I would just argue that if you take a look at the creation of aerospace and aviation industry, an area that has significant numbers of controls and an area that is just logically sort of connected to a broader qualitative military advantage, and a high-speed rail industry that doesn't have those protections, that the outcome was that the PRC was, in fact, successful in achieving sort of global leadership in that sector. And it's been unsuccessful in sectors that it also identified in areas that they wanted to have global leadership, but that those controls were in place. I think the same thing plays out for semiconductors. The same thing plays out in industrial robotics. The same thing plays out in some advanced materials. And so in a number of sectors where those things exist, the PRC has not been as successful, right? Which I would suggest that then selective decoupling, which I would consider to be really continued uncoupling, is likely to result in continuing to hold them back in those areas.
Rebecca?
Well, I think we need only look at where China has come from and the speed at which it has developed in so many of these sectors. This would not have been an argument 2 decades ago at all. And now we are viewing China as a threat. So I think if you look at the number of patents, worldwide patents, China has surpassed the US. If you look at national R&D spending, China has surpassed the US. If you look at venture capital spending, it's on par. I think it's just a matter of time before China catches up in some of these sectors that it's still lagging in. It's advanced beyond us in many, many areas, but granted, semiconductors is an area that China is still developing. And I think it's just a matter of time before these sectors, China takes a lead in more and more sectors than it already has.
Okay. We have a question from Marco Luisi, who is studying for his master's at Shanghai University. And he says, as a student, I've been reading a lot about the EU regulatory power on matters of privacy and data processing and industrial policy. Do you think that the EU, from this perspective, might be a good counterbalancing force to curb the spread of Chinese standards? So maybe a little bit not outside our issue areas, but nevertheless, a very good question. So Rebecca, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. He seems to be talking about two different things, the privacy and the standards.
Yes, I think that's right. But do you think that EU regulatory power is going to be important and influential in trying to curb the spread of Chinese
privacy
standards?
Issues? Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, I think Europe has taken a lead on that and could influence the way these privacy issues are handled. But again, I think China will do its own thing.
Matt?
And if we're decoupling, then we're saying, okay, China, go ahead and do your own thing.
Yes, well, that is certainly true. Matt, you have any thoughts on the role of the EU and its regulatory power?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear to everyone that GDPR can have an important role in shaping the decisions of companies around the world that would want to have access to a 400 million person, as a collective, the largest economy kind of in the world, that of course they will have some influence over that. And I think it's hard to see how the PRC's own views on these issues are compatible with what the European Union would put together as its own standards. And so I think it remains to be seen how that will be put in place. But if you were to sort of follow the logical extension of what the EU is pursuing, then it would be difficult to understand how PRC firms would gain a serious foothold inside the EU, given those restrictions.
This has really been an excellent debate and discussion. I know I learned a lot. All of our debates have been incredibly informative, but this has been a really interesting deep dive into technology. And we're going to ask our viewers to vote one last time on the proposition. Once again, the instructions are on your screen. You can cast your vote with your phone. You can text the word China Power to 22333. And then you text A if you agree with the proposition, or you text B if you disagree with the proposition. And once again, that proposition is selective U.S. China economic decoupling will set back China's emergence as a global high-tech leader. You can also cast your vote with your computer and you go to pollev.com/China Power, the proposition will pop up on your screen, and you can just click the button agree or disagree. And this will be our final vote on our final debate for our 2020 China Power series. All of our debates are on YouTube. We will issue them separately as podcasts. They are archived. We hope that if you found today's debate or other debates useful, that you'll recommend them to others, and particularly to educators and people around the world who are interested in these questions of the competition between the United States and China and China's growing power. So maybe we can bring up the results on the screen as people are voting. And now we have 56% disagreeing with the proposition and 44% agreeing. Hopefully we can get a few more votes in. Unfortunately, this software, we have to choose between displaying the number of votes and the percentage of votes. So we can't show both at the same time. But I can find out later how many votes we had. But we did have almost 300 votes in our Twitter poll, which we did run over the last 4 days. And that really had, of course, some interesting results in our Twitter poll. We had 65.5% agreeing and 34.5% disagreeing. This is a little bit closer, and we've now shifted to a little bit higher percentage of people disagreeing with the proposition than agreeing. But we'll probably get a few more votes that come in. It takes a little bit of time to pop into our slide, but that's the way the voting system works. But this has been a fantastic discussion. I want to thank both Rebecca Fannin and Matt Turpin for joining us today. And again, this debate and all of our others will be online. And we hope that all of our viewers found our debates useful. So once again, hope you all have a good evening or day wherever you are in the world. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.